Welcome to Ground Rules, employment law over your coffee break. My name's Pam Howland, and I'm here today with Doug Plass and Jennifer Walrath. And we're here talking today about workplace romance. And we've decided to cover this topic because recently in the news, there was what people are referring to as the kiss cam scandal. And we thought that it was timely, and there's a lot of fodder for discussion based on what happened with that recent situation. And so, for those of you who maybe didn't follow along with that, or maybe you were camping out in the mountains when this happened, that involves a Coldplay concert where there was a giant, what do you call it, like jumbotron, and it zoomed in on a CEO from a tech startup called Astronomer who was caught cozying up with his HR chief. And that went viral. It turned out that he was married, and it caused a lot of fallout in the workplace. And so we thought that it would be timely and important, and I guess for us, kind of fun and maybe not as intense as some of our topics, to think through some of these workplace romance issues as it comes on the heels of what people have been talking about this week on the news. So we sat down and we were noodling through situations that we've seen that involve workplace romance. And some of the things, the concerns that we hear from employers and the different perspectives that employers take on this issue. And I think some of it comes down to these competing beliefs or interests by employers. You know, how far do you go to regulate your employees' personal lives? You know, we have calls that we get sometimes from employers who say we are not going to prohibit people from dating. People are at our office working hard for a big chunk of their week. We want people to be happy. We want them to come to work, and we don't want to meddle in people's personal lives. So we are not going to have a policy that prohibits employees from dating. We're employment lawyers, and our focus is on compliance. So whenever we hear that, I think I cringe a little. And from my perspective, the risk involved in not having some type of guidelines and policies on dating in the workplace can far outweigh what I would say would be the benefits of allowing open dating in the workplace. So, Jennifer, Doug, you guys jump in and give us an idea of some of the types of cases you've run across and the types of issues that come up related to employees dating in the workplace.
Well, I was just thinking about your kiss cam example, right? I don't know what policies Astronomer does or doesn't have, this company, but we have seen similar situations come up where an employer maybe has taken the approach of we want to not prohibit employees from having relationships. We don't have a policy prohibiting it. Then they find out that two employees are having a relationship and maybe that one of the employees is married, and they find that troubling, right? Because they don't like this idea that someone's like cheating on their spouse with someone in the workplace. But then if they don't have a policy prohibiting it, it makes it a little more difficult to discipline people for that conduct, right? And to say, we don't want this in the workplace because you haven't already said that. So I think in some ways, having that is one of the risk points, I guess, that there is a scenario that comes up that you just hadn't thought about because maybe the assumption was that, you know, uh, people who are in relationships in the workplace are otherwise untethered, right? And this is two single people who are in a consensual relationship, is kind of the whole premise of allowing open dating. But then a situation arises that's different, and suddenly you're in a situation where you'd like to be able to say, we don't want that to happen, or we want to take some action, but not having a policy against it just makes it a little bit harder.
Yeah, and when we were thinking about this, before we started talking today, I guess I was struck by how common this is, like, how many cases we've come across that involve a workplace relationship, and, as employment lawyers, our probably biggest concern here has to do with supervisory relationships. Whenever you have a supervisor that is involved romantically with or even not involved romantically, but showing interest in being involved romantically, with a subordinate, that creates a tremendous amount of risk for the organization. So, I could think of 3 or 4 off the top of my head, that have involved that, where the supervisor either there was some relationship and then it went sour, or there was, a supervisor was making overtures and trying to establish a relationship, and then, the employee complained and that what in both of those cases, the business ends up paying a bunch of money.
Yeah, the standard under Title VII that relates to discrimination, harassment, the standard for proving harassment by a supervisor as to an employee, it's a almost a strict liability. Like if the supervisor commit harassment as to a subordinate, it's a pretty easy threshold for an employee to prove that there's liability under the statute. So we take the stance frequently. You've got to make sure your supervisors know and understand that if they commit some type of harassment or discrimination, it's a huge problem for the company. And that's why they need to know and understand what the law requires and why they need to take the high road and to model good behavior for everyone else to see. So this kiss cam situation involved the CEO of that company, right? And so that's got its own set of problems just because the leader at the highest level, was seen who's married was seen with a coworker, the HR chief, clearly in some type of romantic relationship. So the supervisor piece is so important from a liability perspective that your supervisors have to know that. And if you're an employer listening to this, hopefully for sure you at least have some kind of policy in place that says your supervisors can't date subordinates.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, just to be clear, like, that is the highest risk. It is still possible to have, peer employees, a situation where maybe they had a relationship and it went sour, like Doug was saying, and then one of them claims the other was actually harassing them the entire time. It is a little different standard, so there's certainly a lot more risk with supervisors, but, also worth thinking about for that reason, whether to allow any kind of relationships in the workplace, or if you do, how do you handle that? Do you want Probably you wanna know about that, have it disclosed to you, things like that, all of which, weigh in favor of having some kind of policy in place at the workplace.
Yeah. And while the supervisor and the subordinate are dating, as long as everything's going well, as long as they're both single, maybe it doesn't feel to an employer like you have a huge amount of risk. But one of the biggest risks, of course, is that things change. If that relationship goes south, it's very easy suddenly for what appears to be a consensual, happy relationship to look like something very different. And what we see too is it's the optics of that, right? Like, even when things are going great in a relationship like that, for those 2 people, it's what everyone else is saying, and the optics of favoritism, someone's being treated better in the workplace than I am. Of course, the supervisor's gonna treat her better because he's dating her. There's an extra incentive for favorable treatment, which gives this appearance of unfairness in the workplace.
Yeah, and a lot of claims come from the appearance of unfairness, that's it has to come from someone's mind somewhere, and when you have that, uh, it's really, it's really the ground for which risk, is growing out of.
Right, so legal risk, but also just operational risk where you're gonna have people who are potentially unhappy with how things are going in the workplace.
Yeah. And along with that, not just an appearance of favoritism, but just disruption in general, a lack of productivity. People are now talking about it. People are thinking about it. People are watching it. People are analyzing it. Again, it just distracts from what you really want people doing when they're at work. So we have seen the supervisor-subordinate breakup play out in a number of scenarios, and they can be quite ugly. And with some of the lawsuits, we've seen somewhat of a trend with not just seeing a harassment or a discrimination type claim, but also battery, assault, somewhat of a mix of other bordering criminal counts too. So that as an employer, obviously, that's not ideal. You know, now you're taking some type of reputational hit. Like, do you really want people looking at your business going, whoa, they allowed that? And now we're seeing someone accused of assault, battery, unwanted touching type claims. So that can be particularly difficult to defend against too. So we've seen the supervisor subordinate issue play out. We've also seen, if you're a business owner listening to this, you should be paying attention too, because we've also seen it play out where a business owner has a relationship with an employee. And under Title VII, it's a slightly different analysis with a business owner, but the optics on that can look absolutely horrible too. Because again, when you have someone in a position of power, and is there any higher position than the person who owns the company, engaging in a romantic relationship with an employee who works there, that relationship goes south, it can trigger a whole bunch of claims. So owners, certainly, you need to be careful of that too.
I would say the highest risk is the owners. Uh, if an owner is being accused of harassment and the employee can prove the harassment, it's almost impossible to defend against that claim. So definitely agree with what Pam's saying in terms of owners. Be listening, beware. You're kind of held to the highest standard out there.
Yep. Yeah. Another scenario. So this one is also related to this issue. What do you do about husband and wives? Like, do you allow people who are married to both work for your company? We have had a number of cases where we've seen issues with that too. And again, you've got the situation of what appears to be, you know, you can have it even if they're not in a reporting relationship. You can have a situation where it's disruptive, where it looks like someone's treating someone else more favorable. And we've had a few situations that involve safety concerns related to that. So here's a scenario. What do you do if you're an employer and you have a husband and wife a couple working there, and you receive information on a Monday that on Saturday night the police were called to their home for some kind of domestic violence disturbance? I mean, that can create a lot of questions and concerns for employers too. And what do you do if your employees are now coming to you saying, we're worried, we don't know if there's a safety problem, we think the husband might be violent, we need some kind of assurance of protection? So again, we've seen that one play out. And I would say that all of these signal a need for the employer to really think through what your policies are. And some of this can be addressed through your handbook policies. Obviously, some of these are bigger issues. It's going to take leadership buy-in to figure out, what do we want to do, what don't we want to do, and how's this going to play out. But certainly, your handbook policies, and what type of language you've found in them is going to provide you the tools you need to handle some of these situations.
Yeah, I agree. I was just thinking, a lot of employers have a workplace violence policy, right, that prohibits violence in the workplace. Um, and if you do have a situation where there's an allegation or possibility of domestic violence, that is one of the policies that might give you some tools to figure out as the employer whether and what do we do about this scenario or employees coming to us concerned, right? So having that kind of laid out can help you to work through those issues because I can tell you they're not easy. The times that we've had them come up, um, you know, the reaction tends to be we have to do something about this. And maybe there is something that you need to do or should be doing, but not always. And it is a very emotionally charged issue for a lot of people. And I think it's helpful to kind of think through it and work through it if you have a policy in place that kind of lays out what is our standard here, what have we told people, what are our values, what are our procedures and protocols, all those things, right? It just really helps an employer to navigate those issues and decide what they need to do, should do, and what maybe they shouldn't do, because if it's not in the workplace, sometimes it's not appropriate for the employer to do something, but sometimes it is. And then we also talked about, whether or not you have a relationship policy that sets out what kinds of relationships are allowed, which ones are not. In what circumstances do you, as the employer, want to be notified of a relationship existing? Things like that. Again, that just really helps you to, when these situations arise, work through next steps of what do we do to handle or address the situation.
Yeah.
And I think, when employers start thinking about the possibilities that exist, may cause them to rethink whether they want to allow these things at all. That's really what we're here to do, is kind of describe what can happen. And in fact, it might not even, you might have the same situation even if you don't have employees that are in a relationship, right? You might find out about some domestic violence involving one of your employees and their spouse, um, and the other employees might have a problem with that as well. So you may still have to address these issues even if you don't allow workplace relationships.
Yeah. So thinking through a few of the policies that could relate to an issue like this, again, your handbook is going to be the rules of the road for your workplace. So thinking through, have you updated your handbook and do you have policies that are going to help you if a situation like this comes up? So Jennifer touched on the personal relationship policy. We recommend a policy that talks about what type of relationships are allowed and aren't allowed, and that indicates what you're going to do if you think there's a potential conflict of interest related to people dating. That can be a very handy policy if a problem comes up. It's certainly much easier to have that discussion and to address a situation if you can open your handbook to a policy and say, hey, you signed off on this. This has always been our policy. And we're now going to invoke our discretion under this policy to take some action. So that's a good one to think about. The code of conduct, like the standards of conduct, things that are allowed, things that are prohibited. I like the code of conduct to have somewhat of a catch-all that prohibits conduct that disrupts the workplace, because what if you do have a situation where two people dating have turned the whole place on its head and people are unhappy or speculating about what's happened? That's a good one. Your conflict of interest policy might address some of this. Obviously, your anti-harassment policy is going to, of course, be one of the key policies in your handbook. But maybe you haven't thought of some of these collateral ones that would certainly come up too. Even we were talking too about the safety, like what do you have a workplace violence policy that might give you some guidance if a problem comes up? Do you have a policy that requires employees to disclose arrests or convictions? I mean, that might come up. So a really good handbook can put you in a pretty good place to deal with situations like this. And then, of course, good training for your leadership, right? Again, go back to the kiss cam scenario. That was the HR chief who got tagged with that, and the CEO. There's certainly some questions around whether they had the training they needed to know better than to do that. So training's a good one. What do you do if something like this comes up? What do you do aside from looking at your policies? Sometimes we have employees call us or employers call us and they say, "Hey, what do we do about this?" We've had someone come forward and they said they're uncomfortable because Jim is dating Tracy, and we don't even know if Jim is dating Tracy. Like, what do we do in a situation like this? It involves their personal lives. Should we take action? Should we not? So again, look at your policies. What policies are at issue? And then if you find that it looks like there are policies triggered here and there's legitimate concerns, it might trigger the need for you to do some type of investigation. Investigations, as we all know, it's not a one size fits all. Is it going to be a third party investigation? It probably just depends, right? It depends on who's involved, what the allegations are, why someone is concerned, whether there's being policies violated. It could be an internal investigation if it's just a matter of gathering some facts and finding out if there really is a relationship going on. The point is, don't ignore the value you can get when you have an investigation.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to take action based on a rumor or something that hasn't been validated, and then you have the employee who had the act, like they were terminated, for example, come back and say, "Well, you didn't even come ask me if that was true, and it wasn't true, or here's all my reasons why, even though it was true, it wasn't a big deal. If you would just come and talk to me, we could have addressed it." And, maybe that employee is themselves in a protected class, and now suddenly they're claiming that you took action against them for an unlawful reason or because of their gender. Like, for example, if you had a relationship where it's a man and a woman, but you fire the man and not the woman, maybe saying, "Well, you're firing me because of, unfair stereotypes about men." Something like that. So there is also risk in taking some kind of action without looking into it in whatever manner is appropriate to kind of vet and make sure that you're operating on the best information possible and not assumptions or rumors.
This is the kind of thing that we often get some pushback on because investigations can be expensive. They can be time consuming. You may have to put people on leave. There's all sorts of issues. But the benefits of a good investigation are going to far outweigh the costs in avoiding a lawsuit down the road.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever had a client say that they regretted doing an investigation. It shows you're taking it serious, you're doing what you can to gather facts and consider policies. I have had clients say they regretted not doing investigations. And I know sometimes when we're brought in to help, we certainly sometimes think, oh, geez, there should have been an investigation on this. So, investigations, hopefully if they're being done right, it's going to give you the documentation. It's going to give you what you need to show you address the situation well. So if you're listening to this and if you're thinking, I have no idea how to do an investigation, or how do I know if I would bring in a third party, or if we would do it internally, how do I know what goes into the documentation? We do get a fair amount of questions on that, and we are having an investigation workshop on September 25th here in Boise. So if you're listening to this thinking, I have no idea how to do that, and somebody in our office really needs to be trained on that, there are resources, and we have this half-day investigation training coming up. So think about that. One last thing I was going to mention is there is one other possible tool that sometimes comes up in situations like this, which is love contracts, right? We've had clients before say, okay, we have two employees who are dating. They're telling us it's consensual, it's positive. There doesn't seem to be a rule being violated here, but we as the employer are terrified this is going to go south. and it's going to create risk or liability for us. We have had situations where we've suggested the employer put in place some type of documentation that we kind of flippantly refer to as a love contract, where the two people are basically saying in a document, this is consensual. We know the anti-harassment policy. We agree to abide by it. And if for any reason this becomes impacts the workplace or violates the policy, we understand it could impact our employment here. So there are a few other tools out there that you can utilize as well if there's a problem that comes up.
And I would say that tool too, even if you don't have a policy prohibiting relationships, you could still use that tool to help guard against any risk of a harassment claim down the road. So that is a really great option for almost any employer.
Yep. Okay, well, that concludes our episode on office romance. So if you're listening to this, if you want some additional training, or like if you're thinking you need some more tips and ideas on compliance, keep us in mind. We've got our book that we published back in January, and as we hear stuff come up in the news, we certainly hope we can take these on in future podcast episodes. So that, that's another thing. If you have ideas for podcast episodes, be sure to contact us, because we have a lot of fun with this, and we're always looking for new and creative ideas. So keep that in mind too. And then check out our Law for Leaders website. We have a whole host of training options that we provide, both virtual, live, big mix in between. If you need training, if you feel like your leaders don't know and understand these concepts, we've got resources and tools for that too. That's it for today on Ground Rules. We'll see you next time.
Ground Rules hosts and guests are not providing legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction.